become less and less useful, the central government will have to look for other means to sustain growth, and they will be forced into some of these structural reform areas. And then a third thing I think has to do just with the composition of the new leadership. So this is a list of the core leadership of China. The way the political system works in China is the Communist Party runs everything. Everyone in a senior position in government is also a member of the Communist Party. And in addition to their government position, they have a Communist Party position. And the core leadership of the Communist Party is the Standing Committee of the Politburo. The Standing Committee for the last 10 years has had 9 members. In October of 2012, a new Standing Committee was appointed. And of the number of members was reduced to 7. And of these 7 people, the only people who carried over from the previous Standing Committee were the top 2, Xi Jinping, who will become the new president, and Li Keqiang, who will become the new premier. The 5 others are all newcomers. So we've had a very, very comprehensive change in the leadership structure. So 7 of the previous 9 members, including the president and premier, have retired and left the scene. So this is one of the biggest changes in the core leadership that we have ever seen. I think it's the biggest actually since 1993. So it means that it's certainly possible for there to be a major change in the direction of policy because almost all of the leaders are new. The second, I think, helpful point is that the reduction from 9 members down to 7 members means that if you have to do some difficult policies that are going to arouse a lot of opposition, you want to have a unified leadership that is all behind the program. And it's easier to unify 7 people than to unify 9 people. So in terms of getting a consensus behind key reforms, I think the reduction in numbers from 9 to 7 was very important. So I want to address just quickly a couple of reasons why, as I said, the tools of economic policy that the government has used over the last 10 years are not going to work so much anymore, okay? It's very important to understand the constraints operating on government policy. And basically, over the last 10 years, you had a government that was not very interested in structural reform. They were interested in mobilizing lots of capital, which they did effectively, building out lots of infrastructure, which they did, and basically protecting the position of large state companies that were operating in this environment, which they also did. And the way that they managed the economy during this period was whenever growth slowed down, they simply increased the amount of bank lending, and they increased the amount of state-directed investment in the economy. And that usually was successful in bringing growth up. And both of these tools are not as effective now as they used to be. And I think the reasons for this are fairly straightforward. There are 2 key reasons. The first reason is that the debt level in China is now much higher than it used to be. So what you can see here is the cycle of gross debt in the economy to GDP, the gray line here. The red bars represent the annual change in this ratio. And what you can see is that after the Asian financial crisis in the late 90s and early 2000s, there was a big increase in debt because basically the Asian crisis depressed Chinese exports. It had a very negative impact. So the government responded by funding a lot of infrastructure investment through fiscal spending, and so the government had to borrow a lot of money to do this. So for 5 or 6 years, there was a huge increase in debt. Then the economy recovered. It started to grow very rapidly, so the government was able to reduce its the rate of credit growth, and so the ratio of debt to GDP went right down. So this was a very successful cycle of pumping money into the economy, generating new growth, and then allowing the credit to reduce. Then what happened was that the global financial crisis occurred, and the government responded with another stimulus package, but this time it was gigantic. And in one single year, 2009, the debt to GDP ratio increased by as much as it had in the 6 years after the Asian financial crisis. So they squeezed 6 years of stimulus into just 1 year, 40 percentage points of GDP increase in debt. And so now the debt level is a bit over 200% of GDP. That debt level is high, but in itself is not a big worry. But if you look at the history of emerging market financial crises, one feature that they have almost entirely in common is that they followed periods of extremely rapid credit expansion. So when the rate of debt in the economy rises very rapidly for a period of 2 or 3 or 4 years, that's usually a very strong indicator of a financial crisis. The good news in China is that it really increased sharply for only 1 year. So they realized that they'd overdone it, they put a halt on it, and since then the ratio of debt to GDP has remained roughly stable. But I think the new government recognizes that if they have the next economic downturn, they can't do this again. And they probably even can't do this again, because we're now at a ratio of debt to GDP it's probably okay, but you don't want to increase it that much. And in addition, in this period, there were a lot of loans that were made that they're not going to be paid back. So you have a little bit of a problem of non-performing assets, and until you've worked off the hangover from this party, you can't really start another party. So basically, the new government comes in, and if they face an economic downturn, the traditional tool of increasing credit in a big way, it's really not available to them. So they have to look elsewhere. Another problem that they face is that, as you know, China is famous for having a very abundant labor force. And that's still true, but it's changing in an important way. And basically what this shows is just a very simple ratio of labor demand to labor supply. If the ratio is 1, then they're equal. If the ratio is above 1, then it means you have more job openings than there are people looking for jobs. So it's a very tight labor market, and wages tend to rise very quickly. If it's below the line, then it's a very loose labor market. There are more workers than there are jobs, and wages rise more slowly. And what you can see is that before the global crisis, there was always more workers looking for jobs than there were jobs, and so that meant that wages didn't have to rise that quickly. The global crisis made it even worse. Then you had the big stimulus program. A lot of people went back to work, and since then, you've always had more job openings than there are workers to fill them. So we've had a big, big change in the labor market, and the reason for this is that the number of young people entering the workforce every year is now starting to shrink. There's still lots of workers in China, don't worry about that. But the number of young people that are joining the workforce each year is going down, and over the next 10 years, the total decrease will be about 1/3. So that's a very, very steep reduction in the number of new workers entering the workforce. So for the first time in its recent history, China actually faces a labor constraint. It's not a labor shortage. There's still lots of workers. But it's a constraint because the number of young workers is finally shrinking. And what that means is that wages will tend to rise more quickly, and it means that if you try to stimulate the economy through macro policy, you will tend to get a very, very quick inflationary response. So if China tried to pump up growth to 10 or 11%, as it used to be, they would probably have inflation running at 15 or 20% very quickly. So again, you can't stimulate the economy through the traditional measures. Instead, what you have to do is find structural means to improve the productivity of the economy. That's how you're going to get growth. So fundamentally, I'm somewhat optimistic that the new government will pursue a structural reform agenda, number one, because the regime's legitimacy depends on sustaining economic growth. Number two, because the constraints on traditional policy tools means that they will need to find new sources of growth, and they will have to look at structural reform. So that's the overall picture. I want to talk a little bit about another component of the of why it's necessary to move in the direction of increasing efficiency. And this is a slightly complicated chart, but actually the story that it tells is very simple. What this shows is the return on assets, which is a measure of efficiency, in Chinese industrial companies. And the gray line in the middle is all industrial companies. And then we've divided it into two groups. The black line down here is state-owned companies, and the red line is non-state companies. And what we see is a very interesting story. From 2000 to 2007, basically the return on assets of companies, regardless of ownership, state or non-state, it was rising, and it was rising at about the same rate. So this was a story of increasing efficiency throughout the economy, partly because of structural reforms that were done in the late 1990s. The private companies always did better than the state companies, but the state companies were also improving, right? So this was a picture of where you could say, well, we don't really have to reform the state-owned enterprises because they're doing fine. Yeah, they're not quite as efficient as the private sector, but they're getting better, right? So no problem. Then we hit the global financial crisis, and the story changed entirely. Private companies, they had a little bit of a hiccup, and then they kept improving their efficiency. State companies saw their return on assets collapse. Then it recovered a bit, and then last year it collapsed again because we had another industrial downturn. And so now, if you look at the difference between the performance of the state companies and the private companies, it's about 7 percentage points. 5 years ago, it was less than 2. So 5 years ago, you could easily say, you know what, there's not such a big problem in the state sector. Having a large state component of the economy is a perfectly fine thing to do. There's no cost to it. You can't make that argument anymore. It's now very, very clear that this level of state ownership is imposing a very, very large efficiency cost on the Chinese economy. And if you insist on having the state retain this large a share of the economic pie, then growth is going to go down. So I think this is another factor. I'm not sure that the government is looking specifically at these numbers, but I think they're looking at other indicators which tell a similar story. Basically that whatever the benefits of a large state ownership may have been in the past, those are done, and now the costs are becoming much, much more important. I'm running out of time, so I think what I want to do is just skip to the end and talk a little bit about what's going on in the financial sector, because I think that illustrates very well the way that things can change in China. And again, I mean, I think if you're interested in China, you'll hear a lot of views, and many of them are much more pessimistic than mine. And I think there are good reasons to be worried and concerned about China because there are a lot of difficult and complicated problems. But what I always come back to is that the Chinese economic system is very, very flexible and dynamic, and its capacity for change is extremely high. And the changes that we've seen in the financial sector over the last few years, I think, are representative of this capacity for change. And again, it's important to note that the changes are not dictated by the government. We don't have to sit around waiting for some bureaucrat in Beijing to decide what the right thing to do is. Because China is a dynamic and flexible economy, often changes start to occur very rapidly at the grassroots, and then the policymakers only catch up later. And the main example of this is in the financial sector. And as I mentioned, for many years we've had a system in China where the government dictates the rates that banks can pay on deposits, and with a little bit more flexibility, they also dictate the rate at which banks can lend money to individuals and corporations. And the problem was that if you were a depositor, a household, you put your money in the bank, you might get 1% or 2% because that was the government rate. And if inflation was running at 3 or 4%, you were basically losing money. But because there really was nowhere else to put your money in the system, you had to put up with it, right? And for many years, people did put up with it. But in 2000, inflation was picking up a little bit more, and people were a bit richer and more sophisticated. They said, we don't need to do this anymore, and they started demanding that the banks provide higher rates on their deposits. Now, the banks couldn't do that legally because there was a cap on deposit rates. So what they did is they went to related companies outside the bank but closely associated with the bank, and these companies offered what were called wealth management products, which are not deposits but kind of look like them. And these wealth management products could offer any interest rate you wanted, 4%, 6%, 10%. And so customers started moving their money out of bank deposits into these wealth management products at much higher interest rates. And what effectively this meant was that interest rates were being deregulated. So the government had not yet done anything to change the rules on deposits, but the banks and these other financial companies had figured out a way around the rules. And over the next 2 years, these products expanded dramatically. And basically what happened is that the gray line here shows the official lending rates. The red line shows the actual market lending rates. Basically what the banks did is because they now were giving depositors a much higher rate, they also had to go and get higher rates on their loan books, otherwise they were going to see their profits reduced. So they started looking for private companies and other borrowers who were willing to pay a higher rate of interest. And as a result, the difference between the market lending rates and the benchmark rates expanded by about a factor of 3 or 4, from 0.5 percentage point to 2 percentage points. So without the government doing anything on interest rate policy or financial policy, the banks and the depositors and the lenders working together forced a change in the interest rate structure and forced interest rates on both deposits and loans to move to more market-driven levels. So that's just one example of how bottom-up pressure in the Chinese economy can force changes even when the government is slow to adapt its policy. So to sum up, I mean, basically the story of China as I see it today is that China has begun what's probably going to be a long, long process, 10 or 15 years, of slowly moving away from the old capital mobilization, investment-intensive phase of growth to a more consumer-friendly capital efficiency phase of growth. This transition has happened from a bottom-up perspective. It's happened because the economy is changing. But there's basically 3 ways that this transition can go. You can have a smooth transition with a relatively high growth rate. You could have a very bumpy transition during which there's maybe a very serious recession for a couple of years and a sort of a crisis that forces the government to make the structural reforms necessary, and then you recover to a higher growth rate. Or the government simply refuses to make any of the structural reforms, and the growth rate sinks and the economy stagnates. And if I had to give percentages on this, I guess what I'd say is there's probably about a 50 to 60% chance that the government will do enough of the reforms, structural reforms necessary to ensure a relatively smooth transition so that you have, a pretty stable growth rate of around 7% or so for the next several years. There's probably a 30 to 40% chance that the government doesn't do the reforms in time. You get some kind of a dramatic slowdown in economic growth, a bit of an economic crisis, and then the government is jolted into action by the crisis, and then growth recovers. So that's kind of the bumpy transition. And then there's probably a 10% possibility that the political situation around these reforms is just too complicated, and the government is unable, despite a downturn in economic growth, to make any of the changes necessary, and then the economy just starts to stagnate, which is something similar to what happened, for example, in Thailand after the Asian financial crisis in the late 1990s, also very similar to what happened to Japan in the early 1990s after its bubble burst. They hit a crisis.